imprison a world treasure away from the public. One thing is sure, the system is better which puts things where they will do the most good. But our picture problem brings us to another difference between private and public expenditure. Public expenditure is culminative in its results. Suppose the 100,000 people who visit the art gallery have an average of $1 a piece to spend on art. What can each one buy? A cheap chromo, or engraving. But suppose they can buy an immortal work of art. Let 100,000 people spend $1 a piece in beautifying their front yards, and result will scarce be noticed. Let them combine and they can create a park which will change the aspect of the place and increase the value of property for far more than it has cost. Nor is it alone in art. Nature that this culminative value of public service appears. In Baltimore, the medieval custom prevails of compelling each man to sweep the street in front of his own house. It costs many times the public service would cost, and it is not half as efficient. The meaning of our enlarging public expenditures is simply this: the year after year we discover new methods of associated economy or a new service. Of course, we must remember that many services gain nothing by consolidation, and such should be and do remain private. But the great gains of higher civilization are precisely of this kind, which are impossible without vast coordinated resources. These are by far the most profitable expenditures we can make. $1 spent in wisely used taxes brings us to citizens sometimes 10, sometimes 100, sometimes times as much as if spent in any other way. Opposition to public expenditures. It is urged the government spends unwisely, but about the average citizen. Does not the average competency of the state in countries like England, Germany, and the United States to spend wisely, even allowing for dishonesty, exceed that of the average individual? Where do we see more absurd financiering than that of private individuals, even judged by their own standard of interest? The second reason why people oppose public expenditure is ignorance. The public expenditures which offer immense benefits are on the whole new developments. To be sure, cases like Athens may be cited in the past, where in the days of the Pericles 1/3 of the public revenues was expended in art, resulting in a public education which it has been claimed made an Athenian gammon more of an artist than many a modern man are learning. But such cases are exceptions. Our modern civilization has an immensely broader ideal than that of the Athens. We seek not merely art, but comfort, health, security, virtue, intelligence, citizenship, culture, education, and in short everything that makes for human well-being, and that not only for a relatively few citizens with an excluded mass of slaves, but for all. Not such attempts was made in the past by public or associated action, and no such end was attained save by a small number of who made it in a point to monopolize their advantages. The third reason for popular prejudice and a false conception of the character of government. We are not recently become familiar with the fraternal state of old, the state centered in the ruler, and too often his theory of government was that of the Lewis, I am the state. The people were not citizens but subjects, and existed for the sake of the ruling class. A large part of the public expenditure under such circumstances was a loss to the people. When taxes were increased, it meant too often another palace for the king. Much is said about dishonest transactions in government, but how about transactions in our stock exchange? The average congressman is an honest as the average merchant would be obliged to manage monopolies and regulate unscrupulous activity. Private despotisms, or more banquets and wasteful luxury subjects, have become citizens and rulers, and with all recognition of the weakness and corruption of government, there is a little room for doubt that public expenditures are more general in their benefits than private expenditures. When we consider the inclusiveness and their immense culminative power, we are tempted to draw this conclusion. If government is as honest and competent as the society it represents, the greater the proportion of public or to private expenditure which can be permanently maintained, the better. Probably most readers will feel that some qualifications are required, even if they do not at once know that they are. We must acknowledge that above is a high ideal. It requires close examination of accounts and great watchfulness to entrust large consumption to the public. Unbridled public extravagance and loose financial methods can soon ruin a great commonwealth, whereas the damage of the private prodigality is more restricted. The dread of large expenditures in the United States rests in part on waste and fraud in the public finance in the past. Another qualification is suggested by the danger that very large taxation may paralyze private industry. Thus we say that not more must be taken than can be permanently taken, which means that we must not begin an exhaustion of our sources of supply. We could also add that we cannot take more than the state of public opinion at the moment will tolerate. Still another qualification occurs when we remember that if wealth is wasted in private hands, it is sometimes in such hands expended with greater wisdom than could be anticipated from public authorities. It is the function of wise and strong men to go before the mass of men and to illuminate the path of progress with their superior insight. It would be a great loss were there no surplus wealth in private hands to be used for public purposes. Finally, the fact cannot be overlooked that many things need to be done with which the general public cannot be persuaded to undertake. It remains therefore for private parties to do these things, or they must be entirely neglected. Expenditure differs from investment in that it is not directly productive of revenue. The same enterprise may be managed by the state as an investment or as an expenditure according to the object to be attained. The great modern increase in public expenditures is to be judged not simply by its amount, but by its productiveness. Public expenditure is inclusive, private expenditure exclusive. Public expenditure is accommodative in its results. Opposition to public expenditure is due to a distrust of government, ignorance, or modern developments, false conceptions of the character of government. With healthy government, increase of public expenditure means progress, but this principle is subject to important limitations due to circumstances. Questions: definite expenditure, investment. What determines the basis on which a given public enterprise shall be conducted? Illustrate. What is the tendency of public expenditure as regards increase? What possible explanation of tendency may be offered? Under what conditions would either be correct? What will justify an increase of expenditure? What are the natural limits of such increase? What are the advantages of public over private expenditure? Are these true of all industrial fields? What are the objections of public expenditure? How far are they justifiable? How are they to be accounted for? What is the law of increase of public expenditure? Its limitations. Literature. Economics of industry. The relation of state to industrial action. Public debts. Problems of today. Public finance. Expenditures for security. Having considered the general principle of public expenditures, it now remains for us to notice some of its varieties and consider their relative claims. National defense. Under this head is included the cost of army and navy. If we leave for a moment our own country, which enjoys exponential immunities from attack, and consider Europe, we shall find that we are in the presence of the most serious item of national budget. The six great powers of Europe spent in 1888 nearly $900 million for this purpose. Moreover, the expenses constantly increasing. From 1868 to 1888, the increase for the same nations was about 73%, not counting expenses of actual war or interest on debts incurred. This increase is due in part for the more extended scale on which military defense is now conducted, and also to new inventions which constantly make old armaments worthless and require new outlays. Of course, if we are calculating the cost of war as a whole, we should have to add an immense loss of keeping hundreds of thousands of men in forced idleness and the destruction of life and property during actual war. This indirect cost of war, while immense importance to economic interest, is one which we can allude to here. The direct expenditure for war, moreover, however, must consider more carefully. Some economic advantages. In the first place, we must not forget that this outlay has some economic advantages. We in America are apt to commiserate Europe unduly on her outlays for defense. It must not be forgotten that the men who compose the army derive immense benefit from the discipline to which they are subjected. This makes them better producers as well as better soldiers. In short, it makes men of them to a considerable degree. This fact, which is keenly appreciated by intelligent Europeans, is neglected by us. Moreover, a certain part of the army is, of course, composed of persons who are naturally not a help, but a burden, perhaps a positive danger to society. Whatever may be ultimate cost of national defense, it is demanded on economic grounds, if no others. A sense of security and stability is indispensable to economic prosperity, and it worth all it cost is worth all it costs. And yet, if due care is taken, we may expect a lessened need of military and naval expenditure. And while we should avoid slothful overtrust, quote, we should rely so far as possible upon peaceful guarantees. The United States is peculiar in the emphasis it lays upon a form of military expenditure which cuts but a small figure in European budgets, namely pensions for past services in the Army. General Garfield, when a member of Congress, favored a pension bill which appropriated the enormous sum of $35 million for pensions. He claimed that the appropriation would never pass this amount, and that through the death of the pensioners, the amount would steadily diminish. Since the appropriation has been quadrupled and now equals or exceeds the direct cost of the most powerful standing army in the world, it is not in any sense a military necessity as regard either present or future. Immense resources which might be expended by the state, which incalculable advantage, and are thus distributed among vast numbers of dissociated and to some considerable extent incompetent spenders, who for the most part are simply use it up, quote, a judicious public who are the same resources would confer equal benefit upon pensioners themselves and like benefit upon all the community, but it would not influence so many votes. Internal security. Under expenditures for internal security are included the cost of our police system and its all branches, including constables, sheriffs, etc., and that all our judiciary systems, since both of these are occupied almost wholly in securing person or property from injury. This expense varies greatly according to circumstances among primitive peoples, and indeed until civilization has made some progress, nothing like a modern police system is known. Individuals protect their own property and persons, the right of vengeance being recognized and constituting a system of summary justice in charge of private enterprise. The increase of expense in this connection therefore marks the first new branch of public enterprise, later a more perfect performance of this function, and closely allied to due more humane treatment of offenders. When more than 200 offenses were punishable by death, the cost of dealing with criminal was slight. Now for most crimes he is subjected to long imprisonment, which becomes more expensive as increased efforts are made for his reformation. When we remember how largely society as a whole is responsible for the existence of crime, and how great is the injustice necessarily involved in its punishment, as well as the gain even in economic resources from the reformation of the criminal, there is no expenditure which ought to be made more willingly than that for the reformation of criminals. Another case of increased expenditure is the increase of wealth and the temptation which it excites. Now interests require new safeguards and suffer increasingly from criminal interference. Not only are social relations more delicate than formerly, but means of injury are more potent. The invention of dynamite necessitates precautions once unthought of. For these and other reasons, the expenditures for this purpose has rapidly increased. In France, the increase from 1822 to 1890 was over 100%, while in England 1825 to 1890 it was over 3,000%. This means not England is growing more criminal than France, but that she is caring for more interests and caring for more humanely than her neighbor. Here too we ought to expect an ultimate diminution of expenditure, but it must come slowly and by a reformation, not of criminals merely, but of social conditions that produce them. Prevention rather than punishment, or even reformation will begin the goal of a wise society. Administration supervision. This is in reality an extension of police functions, though its agents are more often known by other names as commissioners, inspectors, etc. Its purpose is likewise public security. though not so much against open violence as against unsuspected and indirect dangers. This function is really a revival of a medieval system denounced by Adam Smith and discarded in part during the earlier part of the century. It must be remembered, however, that its present form is far better than the discarded one. It includes the inspection of sewers, tenements, mines, factory ships, steam boilers, tramways, railways, etc., the testing of articles of food such as milk, meat, etc., and also of many articles like gun barrels, silver, and gold plate, etc., etc., where only expert examination can be determined quality. We cannot here discuss to the extent to which such legislation should be carried. It is important, however, to notice that the exigencies of modern life have actually forced it upon us in spite the most vigorous opposition on the part of believers in ultra-private enterprise. The more complicated our civilization becomes, and the more sensitive our social organization, the more indispensable such protection is found to be. In an increasing number of cases, men cannot tell what they are buying or discern whether it secures their interests or not. As Professor Jovins tersely says, while it is tensely says, while it isn't a fact that people who live in badly drained houses, drink sewage water, purchase bad meat or adulterated groceries, it is of no use urging that their interest would lead them to not to do so. The fact demolishes any amount of presumption and argument. We may assume that no consumer wants to buy putrid sausages, poisonous pickles, dangerous guns, or fraudulent plate. Thus, the government official who excludes these things from public sale actually assists the purchaser in carrying out his own desires. Expenditure for national defense has greatly increased in recent years. In Europe by the maintenance of armies, and in the United States by the payment of pensions. An expenditure only nominally for the purpose of defense. National defense is an economic necessity, and it is in many ways remunerative. Expenditure for internal security is closely allied with likewise rapidly increasing. Increase means not wastefulness or increasing danger, but improved service. Administrative supervision is a necessary form of protection to society revived after a brief suppression. Questions: what is the cause of increased expenditure for security? Is it justifiable? How far is its necessity a misfortune? What's the real connection between pensions and national security? How far is such a payment justifiable? What is the significance of increased expenditure for internal security? How much of the increase is due to new dangers? What has been the tendency regarding administrative supervision? How much is included under this term? Literature. The state and its relation to labor. Expenditures for the poor and unfortunate. This includes primarily two paupers, the deaf, the blind, the insane, and the feeble-minded, whom from their natural defects are unable without assistance to hold their own in a struggle for existence. We might also include those extraordinary cases of sufferers from fire and flood and other widespread and sudden misfortunes, but as these are less important, we'll omit them from our present consideration. In earlier ages, the defective classes were sometimes most summarily disposed of, but the moral development of the race makes this impossible. For a long time, however, their only resource was begging. As we see from the constant allusions of the New Testament and other ancient books, this doubtless assured them from an uncertain and wretched subsistence. In the Middle Ages, they were systematically but insufficiently and unwisely cared for by the Church, whose great monastic establishments were largely used for this purpose. The system was enormously expensive relatively to its results, but its obvious abuses were one of the chief causes leading to this abandonment. It demoralized the poor, neglected the defective, and treated the insane with almost incredible cruelty. It was a palliative, but not a remedy. Government care of these classes is now recognized by all as a necessity. Their removal from immediate contact with the rest of society and systematic treatment of them by experts. It is not only a great advantage to them, but an immense relief to society. From the standpoint of economics, little need to be said regarding the treatment of the insane and the feeble-minded. The expense is inevitable and should be cheerfully borne. For though abnormal beings they feel, and a human feeling is an ultimate thing, a good or an evil, which we have the power to determine its character, must wholly respect here as elsewhere. However, that expenditure is best justified which tends to prevent insanity by the removal of the causes, sanitary and otherwise, which produce it. If our insane asylums constantly increase, it will suggest that by the state fails to take care of its citizens until they become insane. The problem with the blind and deaf is primarily one of education, which must be of a special character such as local facilities cannot furnish. By means of such education, these unfortunate members of society can become often so useful as to no burden to society. It is needless to say that this is not all of the problem. They must exist, and we are not at liberty to decide the matter regardless of their convenience of well-being. The worst thing that can befall a man is to be deprived of all opportunity to be useful to his kind. The opportunity the state should, if possible, provide for those who cannot obtain it unaided. The difficulties of poor relief are far greater than those of cases just mentioned, and its economic bearings indefinitely more serious. The reason is simply that in the case of the insane, the deaf, the blind, etc., nature has sharply drawn the line between them and the rest of society, no matter what advantage is they enjoy. No one is tempted to become blind or insane for the sake of enjoying these advantages. Not so with pauperism. The majority of men under present conditions are necessarily poor as poor. Many of them are as paupers themselves, so far as accumulations go. Now, if the dependent poor are treated better than the state, then the independent poor are treated by society. Thousands of the latter will join the former. Discouraged by the fact that their utmost exertions they get less than they could receive by no exertions at all, they naturally choose the latter. The history of poor relief is full of such cases. Early in the century, when the Industrial Revolution had produced great suffering in England, a system of relief was adopted which pauperized thousands of immensely aggravated the difficulty. An allowance was given to each laborer in proportion to the size of his family. If he earned enough to meet the legal requirements, he received nothing. If he earned less than the balance was paid by the community. If he was out of work, the community paid his wages, etc. Now it seems just that a man should be guaranteed minimum income by society. But what was the result? The measure was supported by both employers and employees. The employer could now cut wages without resistance on the part of the employee. The men could give whether they worked or not. The wage-earning population became, it is said, mutinous and rebellious, intimidating the overseer. The men could, whether they worked. The wage-earning population became, it is said, mutinous and rebellious, intimidating the overseer. Poor rates became so heavy that it is said that some landowners abandoned their farms rather than paid the taxes. The law was long ago replaced, but the mischief it had wrought is by no means eradicated yet. In America, we have no legislation so mischievous as this, but our experience has been most unsatisfactory. The relief of the poor has been so managed as to increase pauperism in many instances, especially when the poor receive relief in their own homes, and worst of all, when such relief is furnished in money. Fraud in 1,000 forms has resulted in all cases where such relief is loosely administered. Pauperism has been increased, and the poor have been degraded. Experience has taught us the recognition of certain principles, which we can only barely outline here. A careful distinction must be made between the victims of temporary distress and paupers. The first lack of goods merely and may be helped without danger, often preferring positive starvation to the demoralization and humiliation of relief. They are very few compared with the other class, and often find private help sufficient. The second class lack character and must be treated accordingly. Attention should be directed to fundamental rather than surface needs. If a man lacks food because he is lazy, it is his laziness rather than his hunger which should relieve chief attention.